Hello and welcome to the 7th session on government performance management. As always, I'm absolutely delighted that you were able to join us once again. As I mentioned earlier, this series is not about the intellectual debates and philosophies of government performance management. Rather, this series is about a step-by-step practical approach used by many governments to improve performance of their government. So far in this series, we have tried to answer following questions. What is the main problem that we need to solve? What are the leading solutions? Both from lessons from public management theory and lessons from public management practice. What does the best practice methodology look like in theory? And what does the best practice methodology look like in practice? In this context, if you remember, we started by looking at the case study of Bhutan. In this session, we will try to examine how does the Bhutan case stack up against theory. In other words, how would you rate the Bhutanese experience? Is it excellent, good, very good? And that is the main purpose of this session, to develop a methodology to rate the implementation of government performance management systems in various countries. So let's get started. You know, every country that I go to, they claim that they have a government performance management system. And rightly so, they do have a government performance management system. I have not gone to any country which says we have no system. They have some system. Whether it's good, bad, or ugly, they do have a system. And most of them claim, therefore, they don't need a system. Now, I don't want to enter into a debate. And often when you say that here is the best practice, they say, what do you mean by that? How can you judge a system? Now, this is very different from the private sector. In the private sector, if a company makes a profit of $300 million, everybody agrees. You agree, I agree, the stock market agrees, the investors agree. And in fact, there is a reason to agree, because that profit of $300 million was not arrived randomly. It was arrived using what is called generally accepted accounting principles. And not just that. In fact, those accounts which followed the generally accepted accounting principles, using a particular definition of working capital, particular definition of fixed assets, everything is well defined. You follow the system, you come to the bottom line, and you say this company has made $300 million as a profit. But this process does not stop here. These accounts only become meaningful and acceptable once they are audited by an external auditor who also follows the generally accepted accounting principles. Now, once that has been done, then the debate closes. Everybody agrees that the profit is what has been stated. In our case, as we said, $300 million. Unfortunately, in the government and in the public sector, we don't have this agreement. The beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder. Everybody makes a judgment. So you say the performance is not good. The other one will say, well, I think it's good if you look at it from this point of view. So what we need to do as a profession is to start developing generally accepted performance principles, so that we say that, look, let's agree that a good system should have these attributes. So, and that is really the purpose of this session, to start that debate and develop those criteria which help us determine whether a government performance management system is likely to be effective or ineffective. So let's look at the 12 principles which we can call the generally accepted performance principles. The first one is that we must have an appropriate performance measurement system. The second one is we must have an appropriate performance measurement methodology. These are two very, very important principles. In fact, I would call them the necessary conditions as opposed to the sufficient conditions. If these are not fulfilled, if you have the wrong overall system of measurement and your methodology is flawed, I'm afraid it's a non-starter. But even if you have these two, you still need 10 more principles to make sure that you have an effective government performance management system. And those are that it must be a whole of government approach. If you work in silos and you only take 3 or 4 departments, it never works. So it's got to be full, all of them. And the reason is very simple. As you know, that if you choose a pilot and you work on 4, those pilots never tend to succeed because the 4 departments will always argue that why us? They feel they have been chosen to be made an example of or for some political reason. Therefore, that never works. Not only that, the other departments that you leave know that this is a system for increasing accountability, and if it works in the pilot, they are going to be the next. And therefore, they conspire with the pilot departments to make sure the system doesn't go any further. Many implementation efforts have not worked simply because everybody in the government, those who are going to be held accountable, conspire to make sure it doesn't work. So you must start with whole of government approach. There are economies of scale. It is much easier to do the whole of government rather than start with a pilot and struggle and make sure that the pilot works first. Then after that, you have to have accountability from the top. As we know, that accountability always starts at the top and then it trickles down. The 5th principle is that there must be an explicit and unambiguous assignment of accountability. You can't have, as I have said earlier, that the malaria program failed. It's not the malaria program that failed. There was someone in charge of that who failed or who did not deliver, who did not manage the program well. So it must be identified with a person, and only then you have accountability. There must be an appropriate incentive system, and we'll talk about all of that in greater length. We have already, in fact, spoken a little bit about it, but we'll come to that in much more. I mean, you can have performance evaluation, the best methodology, you can have all the information, but if you don't have incentives, human beings do not perform. So therefore, an incentive system is essential. 7th, you must have effective integration of human resource systems in the government with overall government performance management system. Currently, we have the issue that everybody in the department seems to be excellent, but the overall department is perceived to be just 4 out of 10, whereas everybody in their performance appraisal gets 9 or 9.5 out of 10. So that is unacceptable. Also, there must be an effective integration of the performance management system with the budget system. There must be transparency. And transparency has many aspects, but at the very least, people must know what you are being held accountable for, and at the end you must be told, given your commitments that you had made, how much have you achieved. After that, of course, you must have appropriate institutional arrangements, and we'll talk about what is an effective or ineffective institutional arrangements. You just can't have an arrangement which just seems to work. You have to look at the lessons of experience and have a proper institutional arrangement. There must be effective communication strategy. I am personally aware of many efforts, excellent efforts. They fulfilled everything, but they lacked communication, and we'll talk about that. And finally, of course, you must have a strong, unambiguous legal foundation. These are the 12 principles which if a country has, then you can say, well, this is an effective government performance management system. So let's get started once again, and we will discuss this time the 12 generally accepted performance principles in the real world context. And to do so, we will examine the Bhutan case study with which you're all familiar. You saw the interview of the Honorable former Prime Minister of Bhutan and his excellent description of the system. Now we can begin to judge that system and come to a conclusion. So we are going to also recap what we have already done so we don't reinvent the wheel. The first criteria for judging the system is whether it is using an appropriate performance measurement system. And basically, you know, it is that it must be based on ex ante agreement, that the managers must know before the game starts what are the criteria for excellence and for delivering, what is the race that they are running. The second is that it must cover all aspects of organizational performance. It should not just focus on making the road or delivering education. It must be the holistic appraisal of whatever the mandate for that government department. And finally, we must make the distinction between managerial performance and the organizational or agency performance. Now, instead of my repeating this, let's just see what we have already said about it earlier. Now, let's look at another dimension of evaluation. So far, we have looked at how to evaluate. In a sense, if you have the indicators, what is the right way? You must prioritize them. You must have a deviation. But now the other dimension is whether you're measuring the right thing at all, because there are lots of types of evaluation, and you'll be surprised that in the name of evaluation, anything goes. So we must know whether we are measuring we're using the right evaluation technique. There are three main dimensions in which all evaluation techniques can be classified. First, most of them can be classified whether they are ex ante or ex post. Ex ante evaluation exercises basically give you, before the beginning of the year, a target or a thing to do and measure you accordingly. So it's management by objectives, and that's called ex ante because it was given to you and you knew what you were supposed to do. Ex post is what researchers do at the end, which is after the fact. Sometimes when the horses have left, they come after many years and they do this analysis without knowing what the managers were told. So that's an ex post analysis. Then there is another dimension, which is the dimension which measures whether it's the managerial performance or organizational performance or agency performance. These are two very different things. Now, because of COVID, many government departments will not be able to do what they were supposed to do. But that doesn't mean that it was managers' fault. And therefore, you have to take out exogenous divine interventions and then measure the contribution made by managers, and that's called managerial performance. The third dimension is whether you're measuring one aspect of the departmental performance or all aspects. And I submit that if you measure one aspect, that will surely get done, but the inefficiency in the department will get traveled to the other parts and the country will not be well served. So you make a difference between partial versus comprehensive approaches to evaluation. When you put all of these together, you get 8 basic cases. And really the most appropriate case is when you're measuring ex ante, that is, you're telling the managers in a fair way that this is what is expected from them. Second, it is comprehensive, so you're looking at all aspects of government performance, and that's where the budget and even the performance budget and outcome budgets did not measure up because they were only measuring partial indicators and the partial aspects of government performance. And of course, the final thing is that you have to also look at managerial performance and not organizational performance, because you're trying to change the managerial behavior. So that's why it's important. So the upper left-hand corner, which is marked as 1, is the relevant criteria. That's the relevant. And there are others which are all very legitimate studies. It's not to say they're not legitimate or they're not useful, but they're useful for some other purpose. For government performance management, only things falling under cell 1 are the most relevant approaches for measuring government performance. And we will see when we come to country applications, we will recall this discussion and try to judge how countries are doing, whether they measure up to the theory. Thank you. Clearly, if you recall the interview, in Bhutan, they're using performance agreements. Performance agreements satisfy all these 3 conditions. They are negotiated ex ante, so they are based on ex ante agreement with the managers. They cover the entire performance of the whole department or public organization, and they focus on managerial efficiency. In fact, it is a contract with a person and not just an anonymous department. Now let us look at whether they are consistent with the international trend in government performance management. And if you recall, this is what we said about that international trend in government performance management. We said last time that evaluation is not new to the government. Governments have been doing evaluation for a long time. They started by looking at budget, whether you spend the money or not, and quickly they realized that's not enough, so they moved to performance budget, added some inputs and activities and outputs, but then they realized that's not enough, so they moved on to outcome budgets, and then finally the best practice where the governments are, the cutting edge governments, they call it commitment for results by many names, but that or performance agreement is the generic name for this approach. Now, when you compare performance agreements with the rest of the systems, the rest of the three systems, the budget, the performance budget, and the outcome budget suffered from three fatal flaws. First of all, when you look at it, in all the three systems, the objectives are not prioritized. And we discussed that if things are not prioritized, then at the end you do not know whether the important things got done or the less important things got done. So if you do not have prioritization of your objectives, then I'm afraid it's a non-starter. So the performance agreement, or the CFR, which is another generic name, the commitment for results, that includes prioritization, and that's how it is different from the previous approaches, and that's why it represents progression. The second problem was that even the success indicators were not prioritized. So if you have the key performance indicators and 3-4 of them to measure the same thing, because often you require 3 or 4 ways to measure the same thing to get the holistic measure. For instance, if you're building a road, you need to know whether you meet the cost, whether it's on time, whether it has the right quality. And unless you measure all these dimensions, you're not measuring it properly. But if you're measuring it, all these dimensions, and there could be many more, there could be customer satisfaction. In that case, you need to prioritize these. Are these equally important? If they are, you must explicitly say they are equally important. If they are not, if one is more important than the other, then you must prioritize even the success indicators. And I'm afraid the previous three approaches did not prioritize, and therefore they have not worked, because without that, you can again get the easy stuff done and not what really matters. And finally, of course, that deviations. It's very important. The previous three approaches, that is the budget, the performance budget, and the outcome budgets, also did not measure the deviation. So they would give you a single point target. As I mentioned, if you have to build 700 kilometers of road, but if you build less than that, then these systems could only describe it and there was no real measure. And that is another improvement which performance agreement and this commitment for results brings in. So again, Bhutan stacks up to that. It is using commitment for results, which is another name for performance agreements. So it is so far so good. It gets full points for using the right system to implement government performance management. Now let us look at the next criteria, which is whether they're using an appropriate performance measurement methodology. For that, what does that mean? Let us recap what we have already said, and then we will see whether Bhutan is doing the right things when it comes to using an appropriate performance measurement methodology. So now let's talk about the best practice methodology. There are 4 steps to it. 3 of them are taken at the beginning of the year, and the 4th one at the end of the year. And you must focus on it because this captures the essence of what we mean by proper evaluation. The first step is regarding choosing criteria or key success indicators or key performance indicators. Now, most governments do that. That's not a big deal. We've had evaluations ever since we have had governments and also planning departments in many countries. So they have a large number of key performance indicators. The problem is that these key performance indicators or success indicators are not prioritized. So at the end of the year, if you have done two of the less important ones and you didn't do the most important task, then how are we to evaluate? Therefore, prioritization is an extremely important part of evaluation. And that is the second step. In the second step, you attach weights, which is just another fancy way of saying you prioritize your objectives. You don't have to be accurate to the second decimal place. These are orders of magnitude. The first one is much more important than the two that I give you in the example from the health sector. Once you've got the weights, the third step is to focus and agree on deviations from the target. They are called criteria values, and there's a difference between criterion and criteria values. Criterion is like miles per gallon. So I can say that the way to evaluate any motor vehicle is miles per gallon. But what constitutes excellence and what constitutes average and poor depends on miles per gallon. And that would depend on whether you're talking about a truck or a car or a scooter. 10 miles per gallon may be excellent for a large truck, but it may be terrible for a scooter. So those levels of criterion which distinguish excellent from very good and poor are called criteria value. One can use a 7-point scale, a 5-point scale, a 3-point scale, but there must be a scaled concept. That is the innovation. Countries, governments that use single-point targets have not succeeded. And that's the old methodology. The new current best practice is that you must agree on a range of deviations. So at the end of the year, no one has to make a subjective decision. They don't have to say, well, this is close enough or it's acceptable. You've already agreed precisely how you will be judged at the end of the year. And so that's the third step. The fourth step we take at the end of the year, when we look at the achievements during the year, and then we figure out what needs to be done. So now let's look at the fourth step, which is at the end of the year. So for the first criterion, which is percentage increase in number of primary healthcare centers, let's say your achievement is 15. Now that's in between 70 and 80. And if you do interpolation, it's actually right in the middle, so you'll give 75. Now that 75 is called the raw score. And similarly for the second criteria, 18, the achievement at the end of the year is exactly under 90, so you give it 90. The last one is really achieves everything more than the excellent, so the maximum you can give is excellent, so you give it 100. But you can't add these raw scores because they have different priorities, different weights attached to them. Therefore, the logical thing is to multiply them by the weights. So 75 multiplied by 0.5 gives you 37.5. Similarly, 90 multiplied by 0.3 gives you 27. And the last one is clearly 20% because you've achieved everything. And when you add them up, you get 84.5%. Now this is a very critical number, the 84.5, because you have now created a bottom line for the government, which never existed. This is now called the composite score. And the first use of this was by Professor Leroy P. Jones, my teacher, my guru, who in Korea, in South Korea, when working on the reform of the public sector, started using this word. He created this bottom line for public enterprises, and from that point, it has now been used for government in many, many countries, and we will talk about that. But this is the composite score. This composite score is very important, so let me take a moment to make sure that we understand its significance. Composite score, for the first time, you're seeing right in front of your eyes the bottom line for the government being created. This is the bottom line. So when you have to judge whether countries are doing a good job at evaluation or not, you have to ask yourselves, are they creating this composite score? You can call it by any other name. It can be called a performance index or a weighted score. Name doesn't matter, but the methodology matters. Did they take these 4 steps to come to this conclusion? All things said, what is the government performance? And how are we to interpret 84.5? What it really means in common sense terms is that if everything had been done, you would get 100. If nothing had been done, you would get 0. So 84.5 simply means that the government department has achieved 84.5% of the promises it made. So it is really a measure between promise and delivery. If 100 is the promise, then 84.5 is the delivery. And that is the significance, the importance, and you will see ultimately the critical role it plays in government performance management. Again, just to remind you, indeed, Bhutan is using the best practice performance evaluation or performance measurement methodology. You can see that it has the vision, mission, the section 1, section 2 has all the right structure. It is using criteria values, which distinguishes what is excellent, what is poor. So it is using a methodology which enables Bhutan to come to a conclusion that what is the composite score? In other words, all things considered, how is the department doing? So again, they get full marks for using the best practice methodology. So let's go to criteria number 3, whole of government coverage. Now, when it comes to coverage, few countries can match what Bhutan did. They started quite aggressively and they expanded the system within 2.5, 3 years. The entire public sector was covered with performance agreements. Don't take my word for it. Let's listen to what the former Prime Minister of Bhutan had to say on this.
In fact, during the second half of our first year, we signed performance agreements with all the ministries and all the districts. We have 20 districts. So the executive heads of all the districts and the ministers, all 10 ministers. So I, as Prime Minister at that time, signed annual performance agreements with all of them. Yeah. So 10 ministers and 20 executive heads of the districts. That was the pilot. And by then we had the Government Performance Management Department under the PMO, and so we were a lot more well established. And by the second year, again, we had the Prime Minister signed, well, I signed agreements with 10 ministers. The 10 ministers signed agreements with their directors, with their respective directors. Also, I signed agreements with the autonomous agencies of the government. They're autonomous outside the ministries. But we did not sign agreements with constitutional bodies. So the judiciary, the Anti-Corruption Commission, the Election Commission of Bhutan, the Royal Civil Service Commission. I mean, they are constitutional and they need to keep the government in check. So if we sign with them, then we are actually working hand in glove. And to keep the separation of powers, to maintain checks and balances, we did not sign agreements with constitutional bodies. Then we signed agreement. So the Prime Minister signed with ministers and the heads of autonomous agencies. Those heads and the ministers signed agreements with their respective directors and secretaries, with their secretaries. The secretaries signed agreements with their directors. At the districts, again, I signed, as Prime Minister, I signed agreements with the executive heads, we call them Zongdas, governors, and then they signed agreements with the heads of local governments. So there are 205 local governments. So they signed agreements with their local governments. Second, by the third year, we expanded it even further to include the departments of the governments. And by then, the annual performance agreement system signing was being like almost institutionalized. The other advantage was every year we would identify priorities, and they had to be included as mandatory indicators in the annual performance agreements. They were mandatory. So whether it was the Ministry of Finance or Foreign Ministry, I'll get back to the Foreign Ministry, or it was an agreement between the Prime Minister and the governor of a district, or the agreement between the governor of that district and a local government head. These mandatory indicators had to be included. So, for instance, women empowerment was one of them. Anti-corruption was another one. Ease of doing business, another one. So on and so forth. Yeah. Now, government G2C, government to citizen services. I remember that was also a big one. Now, there would be, whenever you have annual performance agreements, you have ministries like the Foreign Ministry who say, oh, our work is very broad, it is very conceptual, it is diplomacy, so you can't put it on paper, and in fact, you can't even quantify it. And it took some convincing that yes, you can quantify. If you can't quantify it, that means it's not important, or you haven't thought it through. So, an example, yeah, government to citizen services, the issue of passports, of the consulates, consular services,
exactly.
The number of visits that the government takes, whether it's the Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Secretary, to any particular country. You don't want it to be too much, you don't want it to be too low. The number of agreements signed with other countries, ease of doing business. On face value, what does Foreign Ministry have to do with it? Everything. Because they are the ones who will be speaking to trading partners. They are the ones who's got to, in our case, they are the ones who will have to work with their counterparts in India, for instance, to facilitate export of goods, so on and so forth. So that was very exciting, working with the Foreign Ministry.
But if it is any consolation, a long time back when I was doing some preliminary work, research, as you know, Prime Minister, the first country to do this was New Zealand. Way back in 80s, they had decided they will do everything first best, and it's called the new public management. They started this whole trend, and the first performance agreements were signed, and they in fact abolished the position of permanent secretary, and they called them the chief executive of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So they went that far. And I was in New Delhi speaking with I'd gone to do some research, went to see the ambassador of New Zealand because I had heard so much, and he told me exactly what you just said. He said the last ministry in New Zealand to sign on was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We do things you cannot measure. But ultimately, exactly what you said, without knowing that experience, you said exactly what their Prime Minister said. And they finally did, and it's a good example. So thank you.
So they get full marks for using a whole of government approach. And when it comes to criteria number 4 and 5, 4 was accountability from top down. It goes without saying, you heard the Prime Minister that he was engaged with the ministers, and the ministers then went down to the secretaries and director generals, and it went all the way to the employee level. And when it comes to explicit and unambiguous assigning of accountability, you can't do better. Because these contracts, these performance agreements were signed between the Prime Minister and the Minister by name. It wasn't some anonymous minister, it was the Prime Minister and the Minister and the Minister and the Secretary. So again, they fulfill and they get full marks on this account also. So far, so good. So on all 5 criteria, they get absolutely first-rate marks. The next criteria is having an appropriate incentive system. Now, the international experience is very clear that human beings work when there are consequences, good or bad. So if you take away the goalpost, you can't play soccer or football. You do need to score goals, and you should be judged accordingly. Therefore, incentives are very, very important. Now, they need not be always monetary incentive. They can be non-pecuniary incentives, just the recognition. For many years, I've argued in governments where I have worked that, they should just give them the equivalent of a knighthood, a civilian award. Why can't we recognize our top civil servants and give them the knighthood, the counterpart of knighthood in various Commonwealth countries? So therefore, incentives are important. And I think it is fair to say that in Bhutan, they were aware of it. The very top, the Prime Minister wanted it from day one, and they did in some ways incentivize, because in the years they've had it, they haven't gone all the way to monetary incentives, though that's part of their plan. But instead of my telling you the story, let's listen to the Prime Minister of Bhutan.
Excellent. And in terms of Prime Minister of incentive, what did you think of that? There is a debate that after you have performance agreements, we had a similar policy before we had something in India. There was a policy of memorandum of understanding for public enterprises. And for many years, the chief executives kept saying that, look, you're holding us accountable, but where is the incentive? Of course, there is one that you look better compared to the others, but they wanted financial incentives also. So what is the role of incentives? How did you deal? Was there a debate on what should be the incentives, not monetary, non-monetary? How do you incentivize bureaucrats when you use performance management? Because in a sense, you're asking them to deliver, but why should they?
So what I would like to do is, this is not the most important incentive.
Yes.
Of the three incentives I can think of, the least important, yet what civil servants would consider important, is financial incentives. If I have the opportunity, I would manage the country's finances and budgets and resources in such a way that you actually give bonuses. Right now, we give salaries, but then we give allowances for civil servants to do work that they are supposed to do.
Right.
And we give certain allowances, which is good.
Right.
But my view is, why give allowances? You give bonuses at the end of the year.
Yes.
Or even in the middle of the year, twice a year.
Absolutely.
But those bonuses must be pegged to something.
Yes.
It has to be pegged to performance.
Right. No, well said. Very well said. I mean, Prime Minister, if I may point out, what you're saying is exactly right. In India, the Fourth Pay Commission increased the salaries of civil servants dramatically and said, we are giving you a huge rise on the condition that you will have a performance-related incentive scheme. And every pay commission since then, the fifth, the sixth, and even the last one, the seventh, has reiterated that it's a different matter, it hasn't been done, but we'll leave that for some other time.
Yeah, I mean, companies thrive on that, right?
Absolutely.
Corporations, I mean,
Absolutely.
I can imagine a corporation not giving incentives to their employees for getting the work done.
Absolutely. And if I may point out this, to complete the story on public enterprises, which introduced this performance agreement called MOU. And after 7 years, they introduced financial bonus, that if you were declared excellent, the chief executive gets a big bonus. After that, if you look at their performance, and I've looked at the data, it just shoots up because they were so charged up now. It's just so charged up. They turned the tables. I mean, at one point, the performance of public sector in India led to bankruptcy. I mean, lack of performance. They went to IMF in 1991. After this policy, the tables have turned around. They're so flush with funds that the government borrows money from them to keep the government afloat and for infrastructure development. So incentives do work. especially if they're related to performance.
And okay. So incentives work,
Yeah.
and incentives are more than their monetary worth. I'll get back to you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the second incentive is promotions.
Right.
In Bhutan, we have our civil servants looked after by the Royal Civil Service Commission. Again, like I mentioned, an independent body, a constitutional body. And it's very important to get the Civil Service Commission to acknowledge the work under the annual performance system, annual performance agreements. And so that's a bit tricky. And they don't now, as a constitutional body, I can understand, they don't want to be seen as co-opting the government of the day's policies, lock, stock and barrel. Yet at the same time, they want to support what the government is doing, especially if they think it makes sense. And so it was a fine balance. And I could see, I did not interfere with them, but I could see that they were having a very difficult time. Yeah. So they did have some measurements. Yeah, they took the annual performance agreements. They had their own work plans also based on the annual performance agreement. Every civil servant had to prepare an annual work plan, and they would look. So it was very interesting, Professor. What the Royal Civil Service Commission decided was that for certain types of promotions, or rather individuals are ranked by their respective agencies. So in this case, let's say a ministry or a department.
Right.
The performance of an individual is ranked. And then you can have an outstanding civil servant, you can have an extraordinary civil servant, you can have an excellent civil servant, you can have a good civil servant, you can have a civil servant that requires a lot more training and work, etc., and etc. This is quite common, right? Now, what happens is in the public service, in departments, for instance, and ministries, you want to rank everybody as outstanding, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you want to be Mr. Popular all the time.
Exactly.
So how else to be popular than to rank everybody outstanding at the end of the year, and then they have a better chance of getting promotion, at least in time, if not ahead of time. So what the civil service did, this was brilliant. They said that the percentage of outstanding employees in a company, in a department, must be proportionate to the annual performance agreement, the evaluation.
Excellent.
So at the end of the year, you're evaluating the annual performance agreements. And if you got 95 and above, for instance, you can have this many percentage of outstanding people only. It's not, but if you get only 80 and above, you can have only this many outstanding. It's just not possible.
Excellent.
So this was a brilliant way of getting our civil service team.
Agreed. Excellent. It's an innovation I've often thought, but didn't realize it had been implemented in Bhutan. Wonderful. Prime Minister.
So the second incentive is promotions. Okay.
Sure.
Third, and I think the most important incentive is giving public servants the wherewithal to do public service, to give them the wherewithal, the support, the resources, and the acknowledgement to serve the public, because that's what most public servants aspire to do. And so if you allow them to work, that in itself is a very good incentive. If you acknowledge that they have worked, it's a bigger incentive. So these are the incentives.
Now, we have already discussed point number 7, which is one of the most important generally accepted performance principle, that there must be a connection between the departmental performance and individual performance. If there is a disconnect, then you have this, that everybody in the department is excellent, but the department is not excellent or it's rather poor. How can that happen? And I've had the Cabinet Secretary of India come to me and said that, can you explain that? So it's a very common thing. It happens all over the world. But in Bhutan, they were not only aware of it, but they did something interesting. And let's once again listen to the former Prime Minister of Bhutan, Dasho Tshering Tobgay.
The civil servants are managed under an autonomous agency, a constitutional body called the Royal Civil Service Commission. So obviously, the Royal Civil Service Commission also must agree to not just recognize, but to acknowledge the results of the annual performance agreements of the government performance management system. How else do you recognize whether a civil servant has performed or not? And so that forms a part of the policy also. And also,
well, when it comes to principle number 8, the integration of performance management with budget systems, I think Bhutan again scores very well. They may not have had a very finely defined theoretical system, but they match the two. In fact, in most countries, we have the budget and then we try to have performance criteria figured out. And so we try to get the maximum bang for the buck, but they reversed the process. They said, what is it that the country needs in Bhutan? And then how do we fund the performance? And that was a remarkable approach. And I think, again, Bhutan does well. But let's listen to the Prime Minister once again on this topic.
And there are two very, very important. Well, overall, we had every year we would identify what the key objectives of the government would be. Yeah. And then what we also did was that the budgets, you would get budgets only, the basis of the budgets approved, not even approved, discussion of the budgets were going to be based on the annual performance agreement.
If I may point out, this is a truly remarkable development. I hope you realize that very few governments, I in fact do not know any, which does. This is true performance budgeting, because you first focus on performance and then you give them the money based on what the performance they have agreed to deliver. Usually in some countries or most countries, they make the budget and then they say, how much bang can you give for the buck? But basically saying, how much buck do you need for this bang? Because they kind of commit to what they will do, and then you have a discussion, can we fund this thing or not? Which is, in my view, the wave of the future. That's really the correct way to do. You must decide what is the right thing to do, and then figure out the resources and have a discussion. But you must first figure out what is it that country needs first. And I think so. Just wanted to highlight that that's not such a ordinary thing, because you're so modest in saying that. It needs to be pointed out that few countries I'm aware of have done this. And this is true performance budgeting.
Well, we have a long way to go. Yeah. Anyway, ministries of finance the world over are known to be very, very, they jealously guard their turf. And budgeting is, as far as they're concerned, their business. You can do your planning, but budgeting, you leave it to us. And so what happens is you're working in parallel. You have planning on the one hand, and you have budgeting. Now, in our case, the danger was you had planning on the one hand, you had budgeting on the other hand, and then you had government performance on the other hand. So it could be really messy. So what we wanted to do is the annual performance agreements within the government performance management system, that had to be the core driver, which gave the framework for budget negotiation. Because the line ministry and the Ministry of Finance, they actually negotiate the budget for the next year. So it had to be based on something. And that basis had to be the annual performance agreement. Now, if budgets couldn't be committed, then the Prime Minister would be informed. And if required, the annual performance agreement would have to be tweaked. But in general, actually, there's enough money to get things done.
Excellent.
What's put in the annual performance agreement can be done. And then the whole planning process, yeah, you don't need to do it separately. You have your overall plans, you have your overall targets, and that has to be subsumed within the annual performance agreement. One of the advantages was budgeting.
So far, Bhutan is doing well. Bhutan is really doing well. So out of the 8 criteria out of 12, they have done well. The 9th criteria was transparency, that we must know what is it that the government departments are committing, and there must be consequences. Absolutely, people must know there should be transparency. Clearly, you saw that we have access to these performance agreements. These were widely available documents. They were not part of some secret documentation. People in the government knew which department was supposed to do what. So to that extent, there was ex ante transparency. Ex post, as the Honorable Prime Minister just mentioned, these things were discussed by the Royal Civil Service Commission, so everybody knew how they had done, how the department had done. So I think on this account also, when it comes to transparency, they did a good job in Bhutan. Now let's look at the appropriate institutional arrangements. In every country where performance management has worked, it has worked because it was located in the highest office in the land, whether it was the Prime Minister's delivery unit in the United Kingdom, or whether it was the Vice President Al Gore running the government performance system in the United States of America. Even in India, it was run out of the Prime Minister's office in the Cabinet Secretariat. And we'll talk about that at some point. But our focus here is whether the institutional arrangements in Bhutan were effective. And so before we declare our verdict, let's listen to the Prime Minister describe the institutional arrangements they put up for implementing a government performance management system in Bhutan.
Year round, we actually monitored, we had a midterm review, and we had an evaluation where the department, the government performance management department, would sit with each and every signatory and then would brief me where, as Prime Minister, where there were shortcomings, where I had to either deliver on my part or call up whoever my counterpart was who had signed the agreement and find out what was happening. So that was the second year. So in terms of building the institution, we have this government performance management department. Now, when we set up the system, the department was placed directly under the Prime Minister's office, under my office at that time. And the idea was that as the system is institutionalized, this department would be handed over to the Gross National Happiness Commission, which is the planning commission in most other countries. But the current government has decided to continue to keep it under directly under the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office until the institution actually matures even more, to give it the attention, but also to showcase to all public servants that this system is very, very important. So again, kudos to them.
So we can agree that both in terms of transparency as well as having an appropriate institutional arrangement, Bhutan did well. So 10 out of 12, they're doing well. The 11th one is effective communication strategy. Now, when it comes to effective communication strategy, no one could have done a better job than the Honorable Prime Minister of Bhutan, not just because he was Harvard educated, which he is, and he was an excellent communicator, very effective, and a very humble one. He would go right to the people and do it. So when you have the head of the government communicating and advocating a policy, you have to give them full points. Our problem is usually these things are done at a lower level with enthusiastic bureaucrats, and the top doesn't even know what's going on. In this case, it was the other way around. It was being led by the Prime Minister, the whole effort. He knew more about it technically than anyone else. So he was an excellent communicator, an excellent trainer, and obviously it was his leadership which led to this remarkable success in Bhutan.
So what I did first is when I went around the country, I went to every district to meet public servants, civil servants, and then also to meet local governments. And I spoke to them about government performance management and I got their feedback. In particular, what I told them was you either get work done or you don't get work done. Yeah? Either way, you're not acknowledged by the government because you don't have a basis to prove that you've done the work. And if you haven't done the work, nobody can, on the one hand, hold you to account for not doing the work because there's no accounting. However, many of those who may not have done the work would have actually wanted to do the work had they had access to resources. Yeah. So it's not, most public servants, it's not that they don't work because they don't want to work, it's because they don't have either the resources or they are not acknowledged for their work. And I said, if you have this government performance management system, you will get your resources and your hard work is acknowledged. And I said, once you are measured and once your work is acknowledged, I mean, you've got to be extremely lazy, extremely careless to not want to work because you want to work. Yeah? And so I went around the country and everywhere I went, people generally seemed to encourage me that perhaps this is the way to go. So the third area where I found the annual performance agreements very useful is when I visited local governments, when I visited the villages and blocks of villages, not just the districts. When I went to the village, I had in my hand exactly who committed to who, for what resources, when. And I could look that up and immediately start asking questions to those who are accountable, but also talk to citizens at large about work, about development work, and about what they could expect. So I visited every geog, which is the local government, all 205 of them during the last 2 years of my tenure. And that everywhere I went, the annual performance agreement was what we discussed.
Again, 11 out of 12 isn't bad. Now let's look at the last one. The last one is that there must be strong, unambiguous legal foundation. Now there are two cases that we have of success and failure. One is, of course, in India, we had an excellent system. One could argue that most of these conditions were probably met, and we will go into the Indian case study in greater detail. But it didn't last. And it was because it was created as a result of an executive order of the Prime Minister. And when there was a change in government, the new government decided not to use it. For whatever reason, we shall discuss later. But in Bhutan, the story was different. It still continues, even though it wasn't a law. And the best example of a law is the United States, which had the Government Performance and Results Act of 1993. In fact, it has continued right up to this point. Very few people know that even the Trump administration was using the GPRA because it's an act of their parliament, the Congress. So let's listen to the Prime Minister and then we will try to rate them.
Now this is a long story about the GPMS policy, because towards the end of our tenure, we decided we needed a policy, an official policy, because till then we don't have an official policy on government performance management. And so we drafted a government performance management policy, and it was all ready. It was discussed among the civil servants, all the way up to the Gross National Happiness Commission. It was passed by them, and then it was endorsed by the cabinet, and then we stopped. We stopped for one reason alone, and that was because our tenure was coming to an end. And we didn't want we took a conscious decision not to introduce any new policy towards the end of our tenure. And so officially, we didn't introduce a policy.
Thank you, but I have to point this out to people who do not know that policy continues. Your successor, the Prime Minister, current Prime Minister, has adopted it and adopted with enthusiasm, which I think is a tribute to the democracy and the democratic traditions that you have in Bhutan. Very few countries, and take it from someone who studies this, where a policy started by a previous government continues, particularly performance management. If in the US, every president comes and has a performance management policy, and which is a remarkable fact people don't know. It wasn't just Mr. Clinton, who of course had performance agreements, Government Performance and Results Act. But then when Mr. Bush came, he sort of modified it, and then there has been modification. But Bhutan stands out as a singular example where the policy has continued in spite of the political change. And you're being kind to me, but Prime Minister, allow me to say that it is also a tribute to your judgment, I would say, and leadership, that people have this trust that this policy was in the national interest and it wasn't something that it was beyond. So it is rare to have institutions being made. And I don't want to put you on spot, but the fact is that you created an institution which people appreciate and continue to do it. So I think that is the remarkable part I find in Bhutan.
Well, what do you think? Clearly, the intentions were there, and it's a remarkable democratic move that the Prime Minister did not want to make a law towards the end of his tenure and wanted to give the next government a full free hand. So on that point, hats off to the democratic way of acting and behavior. Democracy is not just simply about voting, but it's the democratic traditions and the democratic way of behaving. And to that extent, they score very well. But they did not have a law. And I think, as the 12th principle says, that you must have strong and unambiguous legal foundation, which was not there. But they had something more important, which is a very strong, I would say, democratic foundation. And the next Prime Minister has used it. And the kudos to the next Prime Minister and to this government and to the Bhutanese leadership, in particular their king, who provides this continuity. If the king believes this is the right thing to do, then it's even stronger than a law in Bhutan. And to that extent, even though they do not in the word, they did not, as they would say, de jure, they did not score well on the 12th front, but de facto, they get 100 points out of 100. Few countries have managed the transition so well, because the whole point is to manage transition. And that objective was achieved, though not necessarily through a legal foundation, that, as I said, a strong democratic tradition and the, I would say, even the royal tradition. So thank you very much. So overall, I think we can say safely that Bhutan gets all 12 points. They've done excellent on this front. So it remains an example of best practice. And I think we can learn a lot from the case of Bhutan. And that was indeed the whole purpose of this exercise. So thank you very much. Till we meet next time.